The Lost Heir. A tycoon discovers at 60 years old that he was adopted and devotes his fortune to finding his biological family, discovering that his real parents lived in poverty, their whole lives searching for him. Richard Stone adjusted the cuff of his Italian shirt while gazing at Manhattan through the window on the 40th floor. At 60 years old, he had built an empire that stretched across 3 continents, but at that moment, a simple phrase from Dr. Williams echoed in his mind like a hammer against glass. Blood type AB negative. Pretty rare, Mr. Stone. Less than 1% of the population. The routine medical checkup at Presbyterian Hospital had started like all the others, preventive exams that his assistant scheduled religiously. Richard had always taken care of his health with the same meticulousness he applied to business. At 60, he maintained an upright posture, his grey hair perfectly combed, and a presence that commanded respect in any boardroom. But something in that casual observation from the doctor had planted a seed of unease. Inherited from which side of the family? Dr. Williams had asked, filling out the form. Richard had responded automatically, "I'm not sure. Maybe from my dad." Now, hours later, that answer bothered him. He wasn't sure. In fact, he knew nothing about heredity in his family. Helen Stone, his mother, had never been very specific about family medical issues. She always brushed it off when Richard asked about grandparents or distant relatives. The intercom interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Stone, your mother is on line 1. Thanks, Jennifer." "Richard, dear." Helen's voice sounded fragile through the phone. "Don't forget dinner tonight. I made your favorite dish." Richard smiled faintly. At 85 years old, Helen still insisted on cooking for him every Thursday. It was a ritual they had kept for decades, even after he became one of the richest men in the country. "I'll be there at 7, Mom. And bring Sarah if she can. It's been a while since I saw my granddaughter." Sarah, his 35-year-old daughter, was a lawyer in his firm and rarely had time for family dinners, but Richard promised to try. Helen's penthouse in the Upper East Side was a sanctuary of understated elegance. Antique furniture, Persian rugs, and photographs in silver frames told the story of a privileged life. Richard arrived right on time at 7, as always. "You look tired, dear," Helen observed, serving the lamb with mint. Even with her advanced age, she kept the grace of an era when women of her class learned etiquette before learning to read. "Just a long day." Richard cut the meat methodically. "Mom, can I ask you a question about our family medical history?" Helen paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Medical history? Yeah. Dr. Williams mentioned my blood type is rare, AB negative. I was curious where I might have gotten it from." The silence that followed was almost tangible. Helen set her fork on the plate with slightly trembling hands. "Why this sudden question, Richard?" "Just medical curiosity, Mum. What blood type did Dad have?" Well, that was so long ago." Helen stood up abruptly, pretending to fetch more wine. "I don't remember those things, dear. You know how my memory is these days." But Richard knew his mother too well. Helen Stone had a photographic memory for details. She remembered the name of every employee who had worked in her home over the last 40 years, the birthday of every acquaintance in her social club, every investment Richard had made since he was 20. Mommy. Richard used the affectionate term he hadn't used since childhood. "Are you okay?" Helen returned to the table with her face slightly flushed. "Of course I am, dear. It's just these questions about the past make me melancholy." The rest of the dinner passed in subtle tension. Helen talked about the weather, about club gossip, about anything except family. Richard watched every expression, every hesitation, every change of subject. Back at his penthouse in Tribeca, Richard couldn't sleep. At 2 in the morning, he went to his home office and opened the safe where he kept important documents. birth certificate, passports, company papers, and a folder he rarely opened, family medical records. With curiously trembling hands, he opened his father's medical file, who had passed away 15 years ago. Blood type, O positive. Helen's file, O positive. Richard sank heavily into the leather armchair. He wasn't a geneticist, but he knew the basics. Two parents with type O could only have type O children. It was impossible for them to produce an AB negative child. Completely impossible. The clock read 3:15 when Richard picked up the phone. Helen answered on the second ring, as if she had been waiting. "Richard, did something happen? I need you to tell me the truth, Mom." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for an eternity. "Richard, it's too late for... Am I adopted?" The question came out like a shot in the dark, but the muffled sob Helen tried to hide was all the answer Richard needed. "Oh dear," her voice broke. "How did you find out?" The room spun around Richard. 60 years of life, 60 years of identity, 60 years of family history, all built on a lie. "I'm coming over now." "No, Richard, please, we can talk tomorrow." But Richard had already hung up. As he dressed quickly, a single question hammered in his mind. If Helen and the man he had called father for 60 years weren't his real parents, who were? And why had no one ever told him the truth? 20 minutes later, Richard Stone, billionaire, tycoon, man who controlled the fates of thousands of people, stood at the door of his adoptive mother, trembling like a lost child, about to discover that his entire life had been a careful construction on foundations of sand. Helen opened the door with red eyes from crying and whispered the words that would change everything. "You were adopted at 3 years old, Richard. We saved you." Richard didn't sleep. He spent the following hours pacing the penthouse, staring at Manhattan through the floor-to-ceiling windows, trying to process Helen's confession. "We saved you." What exactly did that mean? Saved from what? From whom? The conversation with Helen had ended in tears and pleas for him to leave the past alone, but Richard knew there would be no peace until he uncovered the full truth. At 6 in the morning, still wearing the rumpled suit from the night before, Richard was searching for private investigators on his computer. He needed someone discreet, competent, specialized in sensitive cases. The name Mike Carter appeared at the top of several recommendations. Ex-NYPD detective, expert in missing persons and adoption cases. Carter's office was in an unassuming building in the East Village, a far cry from the corporate skyscrapers where Richard spent his days. The room had that smell of strong coffee and old paper that Richard associated with noir films. Mike Carter was exactly as Richard had imagined. A middle-aged man with tired but sharp eyes, rumpled dress shirt, and a quiet confidence born from decades dealing with the worst aspects of human nature. "Mr. Stone," Mike said, shaking his hand firmly. "I have to admit I wasn't expecting a call from you at 6:30 in the morning. I need your help with an extremely delicate matter, Mr. Carter." Richard sat in the cracked leather chair in front of Mike's desk. "And I need absolute discretion." Mike leaned back, studying Richard with the expression of someone who had seen it all. "Adoption cases are complicated, Mr. Stone, especially the older ones. Records from the 60s were, let's say, less rigorous. A lot of adoptions happened without proper documentation, some not exactly legal." Richard felt a chill in his stomach. "What do you mean by not exactly legal?" "Well, in the 60s, especially in the South, there was a thriving market for babies. Rich families wanting kids, poor families needing money. Middlemen willing to facilitate the transaction with few questions asked. Not always did the biological parents agree voluntarily." The room fell silent for a moment. Richard absorbed the possibility that his adoption might have been more than a well-intentioned legal transaction. How much information do you have about your origins? Mike asked, grabbing a notepad. Almost nothing. My mother, the woman who raised me, is in a state of shock. All I got was that I was adopted at 3 years old. There's a mention of an orphanage in some old documents I found in the safe at home. Which orphanage? St. Joseph's, in Little Rock, Arkansas. Mike jotted down the name, frowning. Arkansas in the 60s, and that makes sense. There were several adoption schemes operating around there back then. I can investigate, but I need you to understand, this could take time. Weeks, maybe months. And not always what we find is what we want to hear. Richard pulled out his checkbook. Money is no issue. I need to know who I am, Mr. Carter, who my real parents were, if they're still alive, if I have siblings, if... His voice faltered slightly. If they looked for me all these years. Mike watched Richard fill out the check with an amount that would make most people choke. One question, Mr. Stone. Why now? After 60 years? Richard paused, the pen hovering in the air. Because I discovered my whole life was based on a lie. And if there's one thing I've learned in business, it's that buried truths always find a way to surface. I'd rather uncover it myself than be caught off guard. Fair enough. I'll start with the orphanage. St. Joseph's might not exist anymore, but someone around there must remember something. Records, old staff, priests. There's always a trail. Richard stood to leave, but Mike stopped him. One more thing, Mr. Stone. Cases like this, they mess with people, families. Sometimes it's better to leave the past where it is. Are you sure you want to go forward? Richard looked out the dirty office window, seeing ordinary people walking to their ordinary jobs, living their ordinary but authentic lives. Mr. Carter, I spent 60 years being Richard Stone, heir to a fortune, building an empire on an identity that's not mine. I need to discover who I was before they made me Richard Stone. Mike nodded slowly. Understood. I'll call as soon as I have something. 3 days later, Richard was in a meeting about a new real estate development in Miami when his cell phone buzzed. It was Sarah, his daughter. Dad, are you okay? You seem distant lately. Richard looked around the conference room full of executives discussing profit projections and construction timelines. Everything felt unreal, like a play where he no longer knew his role. I'm fine, honey. Just thoughtful. Grandma Helen called. She said you two had a tough conversation. Want to talk about it? Richard closed his eyes. Sarah had no idea that her world was about to be turned upside down too. If he really uncovered his origins, it would mean the family story she knew was a lie too. Maybe later, Sarah. I'm in a meeting. Okay, but Dad, if you need anything, I'm here. When Richard hung up, he realized everyone in the room was staring at him. He had completely lost the thread of the conversation about foundations and building permits. That night, Mike Carter called. Mr. Stone, I found something. St. Joseph's was demolished in 1995, but I located Father David Morrison. He worked there in the 60s. Lives in a nursing home in Little Rock now, but he's still sharp. And Mr. Stone, Mike paused meaningfully. He remembers a child named William Davis, Billy, arrived at the orphanage in 1967, 3 years old. From what he recalls, Billy cried a lot, always asked for Mama and Papa. Richard felt like the ground had vanished beneath his feet. William Davis, Billy, that was his real name. He had had a life before becoming Richard Stone. He had had a family he called Mama and Papa. When can we go there? Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tomorrow, if you want. But Mr. Stone, get ready. Father Morrison has things to tell us that might not be easy to hear. Richard's private jet landed in Little Rock on a gray October morning. The city was a world away from Manhattan's glass towers, low houses, leafless trees, a pace of life Richard had forgotten existed. Mike Carter was waiting at the local airport, wearing a beat-up leather jacket that looked like it had seen decades of investigations. "How does it feel coming back to Arkansas, Billy?" Mike asked as they drove through the city. Richard winced at the name. "I don't remember anything from here." "It's like visiting a foreign country. Something might trigger memories. 3-year-olds absorb more than we think." They drove through modest residential neighborhoods, past Baptist churches with signs announcing Wednesday services, past family stores that seemed frozen in time. Richard watched everything through the rented car's window, searching for some flicker of recognition, some spark of buried memory. Nothing. His mind remained stubbornly blank. Sunset Manor was a decent but simple nursing home, with hallways that smelled of disinfectant and artificial flowers. Father David Morrison was waiting for them in the visiting room, a thin 70-year-old man with thinning white hair and blue eyes, still bright behind thick-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Stone," he said, rising with some difficulty from the armchair. "Or should I say, Billy?" The word hit Richard like a punch to the gut. "Father, do you really remember me?" Father David gestured for them to sit. "How could I forget? You were one of the children who marked me most in 40 years working with orphans. You arrived on a September afternoon in 1967, 3 years old, blonde hair, huge blue eyes full of tears." He paused, studying Richard's face. "You still have the same eyes, you know. More tired now, but the same." Mike leaned forward. "Father, what do you remember about how Billy arrived at the orphanage?" The elderly man frowned as if flipping through pages of a very old book. "That always bothered me. 2 men in suits brought you. They said your parents had died in a car accident, that there were no relatives to care for you, but..." He shook his head slowly. "There was something wrong with the story." "Wrong how?" Richard asked, his voice tense. "First, you weren't traumatized like a child who just lost their parents. You were confused, scared, but not devastated. Second, you cried for Mama and Papa as if they were living people you wanted to see, not like someone grieving the dead. And third," Father David hesitated. "What, Father?" "You had marks on your wrist, small ones like you'd been restrained. And there was something you repeated always for weeks. Mama said she'd come back. Mama said she'd come back, like someone had promised to come get you." Richard felt the world spin slightly. He closed his eyes and tried to find some memory, any fragment from that time. For a moment he almost felt something, a soft female voice whispering reassuring words. But the memory slipped away like water through his fingers. "Father," Mike interjected, "do you have any records? Documents about who brought Billy?" "Few. Back then, records were minimal. But wait here." Father David rose slowly and left the room. While they waited, Richard walked to the window. Outside, children played on a small playground. He watched a little boy about 3 years old running toward a woman waiting for him with open arms. The scene stirred something deep in his chest, an inexplicable longing for something he couldn't identify. Father David returned carrying a yellowed shoebox. "When St. Joseph's closed, I saved some personal items from the children who marked me most. I never knew why I kept this, but maybe it was for this moment." He opened the box carefully. Inside were a few items: a small faded t-shirt, a child's sneaker with untied laces, and a battered stuffed bear with one missing eye and a torn belly. Richard picked up the bear with trembling hands. The moment his fingers touched the worn fabric, a wave of emotion hit him with brutal force. They weren't exact memories, but sensations: security, affection, the smell of something sweet, like baking cookies. "You called him Bear," Father David said softly. "Never let go of him. We had to bathe you while holding the little bear, but that wasn't all." From the bottom of the box, Father David pulled out a black and white photograph with worn and yellowed edges from time. Richard took it with hands that trembled uncontrollably. The photo showed a young couple, He couldn't have been more than 25, she may be 22. They were sitting on the steps of a simple wooden house, smiling at the camera. In the woman's lap, a baby. Next to the man, two small boys, one of them clearly 3 years old with blonde hair and familiar blue eyes. Richard recognized himself immediately. "My God," he whispered, "these are my parents. These are my real parents." Mike took the photo carefully. "Father, was there any information about the family on the back?" Father David nodded. "Turn the photo over." In faded cursive handwriting, someone had written, "Davis family, 1966. John, Mary, Tommy, Billy, and baby Susan." Richard sank heavily into the chair. "I have siblings, Tommy and Susan. They were taken too." "Yes," Father David confirmed gravely. "Tommy arrived a few days after you. Susan, the baby, went straight to an adoptive family. You were separated immediately. And my parents, John and Mary, did they really die in an accident?" Father David shook his head slowly. "Billy, Richard, I never believed that story. Once, about 6 months after you arrived, a woman showed up at the orphanage. Dark hair, thin, desperate. She was asking for 3 Davis children who had disappeared. The description she gave, it matched you 3 exactly." Richard could hardly breathe. "What happened to her?" "The administrators turned her away, said they had no information on Davis children, but I saw her crying in the parking lot holding a photo, the same photo you have in your hands." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Richard stared at the photograph, at the smiling faces of his real parents, at the siblings he didn't know he had, at the family that had been stolen from him. "Father," Mike asked carefully, "that woman, do you remember her name?" "Mary. She said her name was Mary Davis, and that she would never stop looking for her children." Richard stood up abruptly, walking to the window again. Outside, the little boy was still playing with his mother, safe in her unconditional love. For a terrible and clear moment, Richard imagined a woman named Mary Davis over 50 years ago, desperately searching for 3 children who had simply vanished from her life. "Mr. Carter," Richard said without turning, his voice controlled but intense, "I need you to find Mary Davis. If she's still alive, I need to know. And I need to know today." Mike nodded, already pulling out his cell phone. "I'll start investigating right away." As they left Sunset Manor, Richard clutched the stuffed bear and the photograph tightly. For the first time in 60 years, he had tangible evidence of who he really was. But with that discovery came a deep and inexorable pain. If Mary Davis was still alive, she had spent decades searching for children she never could find. And if she was dead, Richard could never ask forgiveness for not looking for her sooner. 3 weeks after the visit to Sunset Manor, Richard was in his Manhattan office when Mike Carter called. The tone in the investigator's voice was different, a mix of excitement and apprehension that made Richard drop the contracts he was reviewing immediately. "Mr. Stone." "Richard, I found her." Richard's heart stopped for a moment. "Mary Davis?" "Yes, she's alive. 82 years old and lives right here in Little Rock. Works as a janitor at the Regional Medical Center for 15 years. Before that, she worked in a laundry, a school cafeteria, a factory, any job she could find." Richard closed his eyes, imagining a whole life of hard work just to survive while he grew up in mansions and attended the best schools. And John Davis, alive too, 84 years old. He's in a nursing home called Pine Valley. Early dementia, but he still has lucid moments. "Richard," Mike hesitated, "there's something you need to know before you decide how to proceed." "What? They never stopped looking for you all. I have records of Mary Davis contacting police, social services, missing children organizations from 1967 up until last year." She still places ads in the local paper every September, the anniversary of your disappearance. Richard had to sit down 60 years. Mary Davis had searched for them for 60 years. Where does she live? In a small house on the east side of town. Simple neighborhood, but decent. Richard, I need to warn you. It won't be easy to see her. Poverty leaves marks. The next morning, Richard was back in Little Rock. Mike had spent the night locating more details about the Davis family, piecing together a painful but complete picture of the last 6 decades. John Davis was a mechanic, Mike explained as they drove through the city, worked at a small shop. Mary took care of the kids and did sewing at home to supplement the income. They weren't rich, but they were a close family. Neighbors from back then that I tracked down talk about a devoted couple, well cared for children. What happened the day we were taken? Still investigating, but from what I've pieced together, John was at work. Mary was 6 months pregnant with the 4th child. 2 social workers showed up with a court order claiming neglect complaints. They took the 3 kids for temporary evaluation. When Mary and John went to pick you up, they were told the children had been relocated to families that could offer better conditions. Richard felt bile rising in his throat. How was that legal? In the 60s, especially in the South, the system was vulnerable to corruption. Rich families wanting babies paid well for private adoptions. Corrupt lawyers bought social workers, judges looking the other way. It was a booming business. They pulled up on a modest street of small but well-kept houses. Mike pointed to a white wooden house with a small porch where flower pots fought against the fall. That's it, house number 247. Richard watched the house for a long moment. That was the house where Mary Davis had spent 60 years waiting for her children to come home. Did you watch her? For 2 days. She leaves at 5:30 in the morning to catch 2 buses to the hospital, gets back at 7 at night. On Saturdays, she walks to the supermarket. On Sundays, she goes to the Baptist church around the corner. Mike paused. Richard, she always carries the same bag, old brown leather. Inside, there's a photo of you 3. I saw her looking at the photo on the bus. 60 years carrying a photo of lost children. Does she know I'm alive? No clue. To her, you just vanished. As far as she knows, you could have been dead for decades. That afternoon, Richard was sitting in the rented car in the parking lot of the regional medical center when Mary Davis finished her shift. Mike had shown him photos, but seeing the woman in person was a shock that nearly made him faint. She was small, smaller than he expected, with gray hair tied in a simple bun. She wore a blue janitor uniform and worn white shoes. She walked slowly, with the hunched posture of decades of heavy physical labor. But it was the eyes that made Richard choke up, blue exactly like his, carrying a deep sadness that seemed permanently etched there. Mary stopped at the bus stop and opened the worn brown bag. She pulled out a photograph, the same one Richard had seen at Sunset Manor, and looked at it for a moment before putting it back. Richard almost got out of the car right then, almost ran to her and shouted, "Mom," like the 3-year-old boy he once was. But something stopped him. How do you approach a woman and say, "I'm your son who was stolen 60 years ago"? How do you destroy or rebuild a life with one conversation? Instead, he followed the bus to her neighborhood, watched Mary get off at the corner, and walked slowly to house number 247. On the porch, she paused and looked down the street, as if still expecting to see 3 children running toward her. That night, in the hotel, Richard couldn't sleep. He called Mike. "I need more information about their lives. Everything. Where they worked, where they lived, if they had other kids. Richard, are you sure you want to know? Some of this information might be hard to process." "I need to know." Mike sighed. "After you disappeared, Mary had the baby, another girl, who died at 2 months. Complications from the birth. They tried for more kids, but Mary couldn't get pregnant again. John started drinking heavily, lost his job at the shop. They had to move to smaller houses, cheaper neighborhoods. Richard closed his eyes. "But here's the part that'll surprise you," Mike continued. "Even losing everything, even with John sick, Mary never stopped searching. Spent every extra penny she had hiring cheap investigators, placing ads, traveling to other states following false leads. Richard, I have receipts here. She donated blood to get money to keep looking for you all." The pain in Richard's chest was physical now. "Mike, there's more. When John developed dementia, Mary couldn't afford in-home care, had to put him in Pine Valley, but she visits him every day after work. And you know what they talk about?" "What?" "The kids who are coming home. John, even with dementia, still asks if the children have come back. And Mary always answers, 'Not yet, dear, but they will. Billy, Tommy, and Susan will come home.'" Richard hung up the phone and cried for the first time since discovering the truth about his adoption. He cried for the lost time, for the life he could have had, for the woman who had sacrificed 6 decades waiting for children she couldn't find. But mostly he cried because now he knew he had an impossible choice ahead. Continue being Richard Stone, the billionaire who built an empire, or reveal himself as Billy Davis, the lost son who had finally found his way home. The next day, Richard was back in the hospital parking lot when his phone rang. It was Sarah. "Dad, I need to tell you something. Grandma Helen had another heart episode last night. She's admitted to Presbyterian. She's asking for you and—" Sarah paused. "Dad, she's saying weird things about family secrets, talking about Arkansas and how she protected you from a terrible life. What's going on?" Richard looked at Mary Davis leaving the hospital for another grueling day of work and knew the time for secret investigations was over. The truth was about to explode in all directions, and he needed to decide which side of the explosion he wanted to be on. Richard was on the flight back to New York 2 hours after Sarah's call. The private plane cut through the clouds, while his mind alternated between the image of Mary Davis at the bus stop and his daughter's worried voice talking about Helen's hospital delusions. They weren't delusions. It was the heavy conscience of an 85-year-old woman finally crumbling under the weight of decades, guarding a terrible secret. Presbyterian Hospital at night had a different atmosphere from the daytime bustle. Richard found Sarah in the cardiac ICU hallway, still in her office suit, her hair disheveled from hours rushing between doctors and nurses. "Dad, I'm so glad you came." She hugged him tightly. "The doctors say it wasn't a big heart attack, but she's really agitated. Keeps talking about Arkansas, about protecting you from a life of poverty. I don't understand any of it." Richard looked through the window of the room where Helen was hooked up to monitors, looking fragile and small in the hospital bed. At 85, she finally looked her age. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. Let's talk outside." They walked to an empty waiting area. Richard sat heavily in one of the blue plastic chairs, trying to find words for a conversation he knew would change his daughter's life forever. "Sarah, 3 weeks ago, I discovered I'm adopted." She blinked several times, as if processing a complex math equation. "Adopted? Dad, what are you talking about? Helen and my dad aren't my biological parents. I was adopted at 3 years old. That's impossible. I saw baby photos of you, little kid pictures, all from 3 years old onward. There were never any before that." Sarah stood up abruptly, starting to pace back and forth. "Dad, even if that's true, and I'm not saying I believe it, what's the problem? Grandma Helen raised you, loved you, gave you everything. She is your mother." Richard pulled the yellowed photograph from the inside pocket of his jacket. "This is my real family, John and Mary Davis, and these are my siblings, Tommy and Susan." Sarah took the photo with trembling hands, studying the smiling faces. Where did you get this?" "At an orphanage in Arkansas. Sarah, I wasn't given up for adoption voluntarily. I was taken from my family by corrupt social workers and sold to Helen and Dad." "Sold?" Sarah's voice rose an octave. "Dad, do you hear what you're saying? You're accusing Grandma Helen of buying children. I'm saying she might not have known the illegal origin of the adoption, but she knew something was wrong, and for 60 years, she chose to keep it secret." Sarah sat down again, the photo still in her hands. "And this Mary Davis, is she still alive?" "Yes, and she spent 60 years looking for me and my siblings." The silence that followed was interrupted by a nurse who approached discreetly. "Sorry, but Mrs. Stone is awake and specifically asking for her son. She seems very agitated." Richard and Sarah entered the room together. Helen was more alert than Richard expected, her eyes still bright despite the pallor. "Richard, dear, you came." Her voice was weak but clear. I need to tell you everything before it's too late." Sarah approached the bed. "Grandma, you need to rest." "No!" Helen grabbed Richard's hand with surprising strength. "Sarah, dear, leave us alone for a few minutes, please." Sarah hesitated, looking between her father and grandmother, clearly reluctant to leave them alone in a conversation she suspected would change everything. "Please, dear," Helen repeated. When Sarah left, Helen turned to Richard with tears in her eyes. "You found them, didn't you? Your real parents?" Richard nodded slowly. "Mary Davis, she's still alive, Helen? She looked for me for 60 years." Helen closed her eyes, tears streaming silently. "I knew this day would come. I knew you'd find out. Tell me the truth, all of it." Helen took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into deep waters. "Your father and I tried for kids for 10 years. We lost 3 babies. The doctor said I'd never carry a pregnancy to term." She paused, wiping her eyes with the hospital sleeve. "We were desperate, Richard. We wanted a family so badly. And then, a lawyer in Little Rock, Charles Whitman, said he knew our case through a doctor friend. Said there were orphan children needing homes, children whose parents had died with no family to care for them." Helen held Richard's hand tighter. "Dear, I swear I believed the story. When they brought you, you were so small, so scared, but you knew something was wrong." Helen nodded miserably. "You cried for Mama every night for months, and you talked about a house, about siblings. I told myself they were just confused memories, child's fantasies. But deep down," her voice faltered, "deep down you knew I'd been stolen from a family that loved me. Richard, please understand. Back then, private adoptions were complicated but not uncommon. I convinced myself we were saving you from a life of poverty, neglect." Richard stood from the chair, walking to the window. Outside, New York gleamed with millions of lights. A city built on stories of people reinventing their lives, fleeing the past. But some stories couldn't be rewritten. Helen Mary Davis donated blood to get money to keep looking for me, worked jobs that ruined her back to pay for investigators, spent 60 years visiting orphanages, police stations, placing ads in newspapers. He turned to face her. "Meanwhile, I grew up in mansions, went to Harvard, built an empire, based on a lie." "It wasn't a lie." Helen tried to sit up in bed. "We loved you. We gave you everything. You stole my real identity, my true family, my siblings. Your siblings were adopted by good families too. At least that's what Whitman told us. Tommy and Susan Davis. I'll find them too, Helen. And I'll find out if they had the same luck I did." At that moment, Sarah returned to the room, clearly having overheard part of the conversation through the door. "Dad, can you stop this? Grandma's in a hospital bed." She positioned herself between Richard and Helen like a protector. "Even if all this is true, she loves you. We're your family." Richard looked at Sarah, his brilliant and determined daughter, who had grown up knowing only one version of the family story. "Sarah, that woman, Mary Davis, works as a janitor in a hospital in Arkansas. At 82 years old, she still works because she never had enough money to retire. Know why? because she spent her life savings looking for children who were stolen from her. They weren't stolen, Sarah exploded. They were rescued from a terrible situation. You see poverty as terrible because you were raised with privileges, bought with dirty money, Richard replied, his voice rising for the first time. Mary and John Davis were loving parents whose children were ripped away by a corrupt system. Sarah fell silent for a moment, then said in a cold voice, "And what do you plan to do with this information, Dad? Destroy our family to satisfy some fantasy about perfect parents you don't even remember? I plan to do what's right." "And what's right?" "Abandon the woman who raised you to chase after strangers." Richard looked between Helen, crying silently in the hospital bed, and Sarah, furious and protective. Then he thought of Mary Davis, walking alone to the bus stop after another grueling day of work, still carrying the photograph of 3 children who might be dead for all she knew. "What's right," Richard said finally, "is giving Mary Davis the chance to know that at least one of the children she searched for 60 years is alive, and giving me the chance to meet the woman who never gave up finding me." Sarah shook her head. "If you do this, Dad, if you turn our family into a media circus because of this obsession, I don't know if I can keep working with you, or if I can keep being your daughter." She stormed out of the room, slamming the door. Helen extended her trembling hand to Richard. "Please, dear, she's right. Some things are better left in the past." Richard looked at the outstretched hand, the woman who had raised him, loved him, and lied to him for 60 years. Then he thought of the yellowed photo in his pocket, the smiling faces of a family that had been destroyed to create his. "Sorry, Helen, but the past has already found me." Richard didn't sleep that night. He spent the hours sitting on the balcony of his penthouse, gazing at the city that never slept, trying to find the courage for a decision he knew was irreversible. At 5 in the morning, he called Mike Carter. "I need you to prepare Mary Davis for a shock. I'm revealing myself today." "Richard, are you sure?" "Once you do this, there's no going back." "I'm sure." But in truth, he wasn't. As the private jet flew back to Little Rock, Richard replayed 1,000 different scenarios in his head. How do you approach an 82-year-old woman and say, "I'm your son who was stolen 60 years ago"? How does a heart at that age withstand such a revelation? Mike was waiting at the airport with news that made everything even more urgent. "Richard, something happened. John Davis had a heart attack last night. He's admitted to the regional medical center, the same hospital where Mary works." Richard's blood ran cold. "Will he be okay?" "The doctors don't know. He's stable, but..." Mike shook his head. "Richard, if you're going to do this, it has to be now. There might not be another chance." They drove in silence to the hospital. In the parking lot, Mike turned to Richard. "One thing you should know, Mary doesn't have adequate health insurance to cover the stay. She's been in the hallway for 12 hours, alternating between praying and begging the doctors to do everything possible. She doesn't have money for the treatments John needs." Richard closed his eyes. Even in the most desperate moment of their lives, poverty continued to be a cruel punishment. "Mike, call the hospital's finance department. I want all of John Davis's medical costs covered anonymously. Everything. The best treatment available." "You sure?" "It's the least I can do." The cardiac ICU hallway smelled of disinfectant and quiet desperation. Richard saw Mary Davis before Mike even pointed her out. She was sitting in a plastic chair near the wall, hands clasped in her lap, eyes red from crying. She wore the same blue janitor uniform Richard had seen her in days before, as if she hadn't had time to go home and change. "There," Mike whispered. Richard watched his biological mother for a long moment. She seemed smaller, more fragile than when he saw her at the bus stop. Her posture hunched from exhaustion, grey hairs escaping her undone bun, hands calloused from decades of manual labor. But it was the eyes that made him choke up again, blue like his, carrying a pain that seemed ancient and deep. Mary was whispering something, and Richard realized she was praying, "Please, Lord, don't take John now. Not when we still have hope of seeing our babies again. He still asks about them every day." Her voice broke, and Richard felt like someone had squeezed a fist around his heart. Mike touched his shoulder. "Richard, the doctors just left John's room. I'll talk to them about the payment. Want a moment alone?" Richard nodded, unable to speak. He approached slowly, legs shaking. Mary didn't notice him until his shadow fell over her. When she looked up, Richard saw the exact moment when some primal, inexplicable recognition passed over her face. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice hoarser than intended. "Are you Mary Davis?" She nodded slowly, drying her eyes with the back of her hand. "Yes, I am. Are you a doctor? Came to talk about my husband." Richard knelt in front of her, putting himself at eye level. "Mrs. Davis, my name is Richard Stone, but..." He took a deep breath. "A long time ago, when I was 3 years old, they called me Billy." Mary blinked several times as if trying to understand a foreign language. "Billy?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Richard pulled the yellowed photograph from his pocket, the same one she had carried in her bag for decades. "Billy Davis, your son." Mary looked at the photograph, then at Richard's face, then back at the photograph. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably. "No, it can't be. Billy was just a baby." "You are." She studied his eyes, and Richard saw the precise moment when 60 years of searching came to an end. Oh my God in heaven. "Billy?" "Yes, Mom, it's me." Mary collapsed. She didn't faint, but simply curled over herself, sobbing with an intensity that made other people in the hallway turn to look. Richard wrapped her in his arms, feeling how small and fragile she was, but also feeling decades of longing released all at once. "My boy," she cried against his chest. "My boy, you've grown so much. You're alive. You're here." They stayed like that for several minutes, Richard holding the woman who had given birth to him 60 years ago, feeling her shake with tears from a place deeper than he knew existed. When Mary finally pulled away, her hands trembled up to Richard's face, touching his cheeks as if making sure he was real. "You have the same eyes. I always knew I'd recognize your eyes." She laughed through the tears. "Tommy and Susan. You know about Tommy and Susan? I'm looking for them too, Mum." The word Mom came naturally, and Mary cried even harder upon hearing it. Where have you been all this time? I looked for you everywhere. Everywhere." Richard held her calloused hands in his. "I was adopted by a family in New York. They told me you had died in a car accident." Mary's face contorted in pain. "We never died, Billy. We never stopped looking. Your father still, even sick, still asks if you came home. Can I see him?" Mary nodded eagerly, standing with some difficulty. "He'll be so happy, Billy, he'll be so happy." They walked to the ICU room, Mary holding Richard's arm as if afraid he'd vanish again. John Davis was conscious but clearly weak. When his eyes met Richard's, there was a moment of confusion, then recognition, then pure joy that lit up his aged face. "Billy?" His voice was hoarse but certain. "My boy Billy?" Richard approached the bed, taking the hand of the man who was his father. "Hi, Dad." John squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "I knew you'd come back. I always told your mum you'd come home." He looked between Richard and Mary, smiling for the first time in decades. "My family's together again." A nurse approached discreetly. "Mr. Davis, good news. An anonymous benefactor has covered all your medical costs. You'll get the best treatment available." Mary looked at Richard with growing suspicion. "Billy, how can you pay for this? What kind of work do you do?" Richard realized the moment had come to reveal not just who he was, but who he had become. "Mom, Dad, there's a lot I need to tell you. My life since they separated us was very different from yours." But before he could continue, John squeezed his hand harder. "It doesn't matter, son. It doesn't matter what happened, where you've been, who you've become. You're our Billy. You came home." And for the first time in 60 years, Richard Stone, Billy Davis, finally felt at home. 6 months later, Richard was on the porch of the modest house he had bought 2 blocks from Mary's, watching the sun rise over Little Rock. It was a Saturday morning in April, and for the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about meetings, acquisitions, or quarterly profits. The revelation of his true identity as a billionaire had shocked Mary and John more than his reappearance after 60 years. "Our Billy is really rich?" John had asked, still confused by the dementia but impressed by the expensive suits and private jet. Mary had worried the money would separate them again, but Richard had patiently explained that wealth was just a consequence of his stolen life. What he really wanted was to reclaim the lost time. The media scandal had been brutal but brief. Billionaire discovers he was kidnapped as child blared headlines for weeks. Investigations opened into the illegal adoptions of the 60s. Charles Whitman, the corrupt lawyer, had died in the 80s, but his files revealed dozens of similar cases. Richard used his fortune and influence to create a reparations fund for other affected families. Mike Carter had found Tommy in Texas, now a 58-year-old carpenter named Thomas Miller, adopted by a middle-class family that gave him genuine love but never revealed his origins. The reunion had been emotional but less dramatic. Tommy vaguely remembered Billy and was thrilled to discover the family he sometimes dreamed of was real. Susan had been harder to locate. Adopted as a baby by a couple in Oregon, she had grown up as Jennifer Walsh, an elementary school teacher. At 56, she initially resisted contact, fearing it was some scam. But when she saw the original Davis family photo, she broke down. "I always knew there was something more," she had said through tears during the video call. "I always felt something was missing." That year's Thanksgiving had been at Mary's simple house, the first full Davis family gathering in 57 years. Richard had insisted on paying for everything, but Mary had insisted on cooking. "No matter how much money you have, Billy, in my house I cook for my family." Tommy brought his wife and 2 teenage kids. Susan came with her husband and a 20-year-old daughter. Richard brought Sarah, who had finally reconciled with the situation after meeting her biological grandparents. "They're different from what I expected," Sarah had admitted to Richard after spending the afternoon listening to Mary tell stories about the 3 of them as kids. "Grandma Mary has a way of making you feel completely loved just by looking at you." Sarah had become especially close to John, who in his lucid moments told stories about working at the shop and dreaming of teaching his kids to fish. "Dad," she said to Richard one afternoon, "I think you owe me this experience. I want to learn to fish with my real grandpa." Helen had died peacefully in her sleep 3 months after the reunion, but not before meeting Mary in person. The meeting had been tense at first, but Mary had surprised everyone by hugging the woman who had raised her son. "Thank you for taking care of my Billy when I couldn't," Mary had said simply. Helen had cried, finally finding peace with her decades of secrecy. The Billy Davis Foundation had grown beyond any of Richard's expectations. Specializing in reuniting families separated by illegal adoptions or kidnappings, it had already facilitated dozens of reunions. Richard discovered that using his wealth to give back to people what had been taken from them was more rewarding than any deal he had ever closed. Now on this Saturday morning, Richard watched John walking slowly through the yard, still weak from the heart attack, but determined to plant the garden Mary had asked for decades ago. At 84, John had bad days when he recognized no one, but also good days when he was simply the loving father Richard never had a chance to know. "Grandpa John!" a child's voice shouted from the gate. It was Michael, Sarah's 7-year-old son, running toward his great-grandfather with a fishing pole in hand. Richard smiled. Sarah had moved to Little Rock 6 months ago, opening a small law practice and discovering that life didn't have to be a constant race for more success. Michael was growing up with 4 great-grandparents, John, Mary, and Sarah's maternal grandparents, something Richard never imagined possible. "Daddy Billy," John called, using the nickname he had invented to distinguish Richard from the son-in-law. "Come help us with the worms." Richard came down from the porch, joining his father and grandson. John had insisted on teaching Michael to fish the traditional way, with patience and real worms, not those fancy artificial lures. "Remember when you were little like this?" John asked, watching Michael struggle with the worm. On good days, John talked as if the 60 lost years were just a long vacation. "Not much, Dad, but I'm making new memories now." Mary appeared at the kitchen door, drying her hands on her apron. At 82, she had finally stopped working at the hospital, but never stopped caring for the family. Richard had offered to hire staff for her, but Mary had refused. "Billy, I spent 60 years dreaming of cooking for my kids again. I'm not letting someone else do it for me." "Breakfast is ready," she called. As they walked to the house, Michael running ahead with the fishing pole, John turned to Richard. "Son, can I ask you something?" "Sure, Dad." "Are you happy? I mean happier than you were before." Richard looked at the simple house where his 82-year-old mother was making homemade pancakes, where Sarah was helping set the table, where Tommy and Susan would arrive later with their own families for the Sunday lunch they had established as a tradition. "Dad," Richard said, putting his arm around the shoulders of the man who had fathered him, "I spent 60 years being rich. Now I'm discovering what it means to be prosperous." They entered the house where Mary was humming in the kitchen, where Sarah was laughing at something Michael had said, where the table was set for a family that had taken over half a century to reunite. And for the first time since he was 3 years old, Billy Davis was exactly where he belonged, at home with the people who had loved him from the first day of his life and never stopped searching for him. On the kitchen wall, in a simple frame, hung the yellowed 1966 photograph, 4 people smiling on the steps of a wooden house, unaware that their family would be torn apart the next year. But next to it, Mary had hung a new photo, 3 generations of the Davis family gathered for Thanksgiving, smiling with the same genuine joy, proving that some stories, even after decades lost, can still have a happy ending. Outside, Arkansas was waking up to another ordinary day, but inside house number 247, Billy Davis was living the first day of the rest of his true life, not as the heir to a fortune built on lies, but as the son who had finally found his way back home.